Sometimes, life changes in an instant, a single moment that shatters everything you thought you knew. For 18-year-old Jamal Carter, that moment came on what should have been an ordinary afternoon. A boy walking his dog, a loyal German shepherd named Max by his side. The bond they shared was unbreakable, built on trust, love, and quiet companionship. But then, an unexpected confrontation turned the world upside down. A gunshot, a loss no one could have predicted, and Jamal left to face suspicion, grief, and a community that did not know the full truth. How do you carry on when everything you love is ripped away? How do you stand up for what is right when the world is against you? Jamal's journey is one of heartbreak, resilience, and the quiet power of kindness that can shine through even the darkest days. The afternoon sun bathed the quiet neighborhood in a warm golden glow. The streets were lined with neatly kept houses, their lawns trimmed in green, with the occasional wind chime echoing softly in the breeze. Jamal Carter stepped outside, holding the leash of his new German shepherd, Max. The dog was beautiful, his black and tan coat glistened under the sunlight, and his ears stood tall and alert. Max was more than just a dog to Jamal. He was a gift, the best one Jamal had ever received. On his 18th birthday, Jamal's father, Charles, had surprised him with Max, saying, "Every man needs a loyal friend." Jamal took those words to heart. He had spent the past week bonding with Max, teaching him basic commands, and watching him learn with intelligence and energy that filled Jamal's heart with pride. Jamal lived with his father in a modest but tidy single-story house on the edge of town. It was just the two of them now. His mother had passed away years ago, and since then, Charles had done his best to raise Jamal with discipline and love. Charles worked long hours as an FBI agent, and though he was often away, his presence in Jamal's life was steady, like an unshakable pillar. The house felt empty sometimes, but Max's arrival had brought new life into the place. For the first time in years, Jamal felt a sense of peace and joy. Walking down the sidewalk, Jamal held Max's leash firmly, watching the dog trot obediently at his side. Max's tail wagged in excitement, and Jamal couldn't help but smile. His sneakers scuffed the pavement, and the sound blended with Max's paws tapping gently on the concrete. Every now and then, a car would drive by, or a neighbor would wave from their porch. Today felt like a good day, a perfect day. Jamal's mind wandered as he thought about the future. He was nearly done with high school, and though he wasn't sure what came next, he knew he wanted to make his father proud. Maybe he would go to college or work with animals, something that would let him be outside, away from the weight of his doubts. He glanced at Max, who looked up at him with bright, trusting eyes. "What do you think, Max?" he murmured with a grin. The dog barked once, as if to answer, and Jamal laughed softly. As they turned the corner onto a quieter street, Jamal noticed a police cruiser parked at the curb. He felt his steps slow slightly, though he told himself there was no reason to be uneasy. Growing up, his father had taught him to respect authority. "You stay calm, polite, and honest," Charles would say. "You have nothing to fear if you carry yourself right." The car idled for a moment longer, then began to move slowly alongside the sidewalk. Jamal kept walking, trying to focus on Max, but he couldn't help feeling watched. The cruiser stopped abruptly, its tires crunching against the curb. Jamal paused as the driver's door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered police officer stepped out. "Afternoon," the officer said, his voice deep and clipped. His uniform bore the name Collins. His gaze fell on Max, and his eyes narrowed slightly, as though appraising the dog. "Nice-looking dog you got there." "Thank you, sir," Jamal replied carefully. He stood tall, his grip on Max's leash tightening slightly. Max remained calm, sitting at Jamal's side, his tongue hanging out playfully. Officer Collins tilted his head, his eyes never leaving the dog. "Who does he belong to?" The question was sharp, almost suspicious. Jamal blinked, caught off guard. "He is mine." My father gave him to me. Collins's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. That right? His tone held a note of disbelief. A dog like this, pretty expensive, wouldn't you say? Jamal frowned slightly, confusion flickering across his face. I am not sure, sir. He is a gift. The officer took a step closer, crossing his arms. You mean to tell me someone like you owns a dog like that? Come on now, who are you walking this dog for? Jamal felt heat rise to his face. The accusation in the officer's voice sent a chill through him, and his stomach twisted uncomfortably. No one is paying me, sir, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. This is my dog. Officer Collins's expression hardened. You are saying you own him? He demanded, his tone cold and clipped. You expect me to believe that? Yes, Jamal said firmly, though his voice trembled slightly. He is mine. The officer took another step forward. His presence loomed large, casting a long shadow over Jamal and Max. Prove it, Collins said, his voice low and challenging. Jamal swallowed hard, frustration bubbling up inside him. He looked down at Max, who watched him obediently, waiting for a command. Kneeling beside the dog, Jamal whispered softly, Sit, Max. Max responded immediately, sitting up straight, his ears perked as he barked once, loud and clear. The sound of Max's bark seemed to snap something inside Officer Collins. His hand shot to his hip, drawing his gun in one swift motion. The barrel pointed straight at Max. Call him off, Collins barked, his voice rising in panic. Jamal's eyes widened in horror. No, he is not attacking! Max, stay, he cried desperately, pulling hard on the leash. But Max, sensing his owner's fear, barked again, this time louder, more defensive. Stop! Please, he is not hurting you, Jamal shouted, his voice breaking. But Collins wasn't listening. His hand tightened on the trigger. The gunshot rang out, a sharp crack that echoed through the empty street. Time seemed to slow as Jamal watched Max collapse, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. No! Jamal screamed. He dropped to his knees, the leash slipping from his trembling hands as he reached for Max. The dog's breathing was shallow, his bright eyes dimming as Jamal cradled his head. Tears streamed down Jamal's face as he whispered frantically, I'm sorry, Max. I'm so sorry. Please stay with me. Officer Collins stood nearby, his gun still drawn. His expression was hard and unyielding. You tried to sick that dog on me, he said flatly. You are under arrest. Jamal barely heard the words through the ringing in his ears. He felt hands grab his arms roughly, pulling him to his feet. He did not fight back. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists, cold and unforgiving. As Collins led him to the cruiser, Jamal looked back one last time. Max lay still on the sidewalk, the sun glinting off his fur. The street, which had felt so alive only moments before, was now silent and empty. Sitting in the back of the police car, Jamal stared blankly out the window, his sobs filling the small space. His heart felt like it had been ripped in two. He could still hear the gunshot, see Max's body fall, and feel the helplessness that had seized him. Why did this happen? Jamal thought. What did I do wrong? At the police station, the cold air inside the holding room made his skin prickle. Jamal sat alone, his wrists sore from the handcuffs. His tears had dried, leaving him feeling hollow and exhausted. He thought about his father. He thought about Max. The ache in his chest was too much to bear. This cannot be real, he whispered to himself. But no matter how hard he wished, the image of Max lying lifeless on the sidewalk would not leave him. The door creaked open, and an officer entered, dropping a folder on the table. Identification, he said coldly. Jamal fumbled for his wallet as tears stung his eyes again. He thought of his father's words, stay calm, polite, and honest. But in this moment, calm felt impossible. Nothing made sense. As the officer took his ID and left the room, Jamal slumped forward, resting his head on the cool metal table. The silence was deafening. Then he whispered softly, "I am sorry, Max." And for the first time in his life, Jamal felt completely alone. Jamal sat slumped at the metal table, his face buried in his arms. The cold air of the holding room wrapped around him, suffocating in its stillness. He could hear the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, their faint buzz echoing the chaos in his mind. His wrists ached from the handcuffs that had been removed minutes earlier, leaving deep red indentations against his skin. He could not stop seeing Max, his loyal companion, crumpled on the ground, his vibrant energy snuffed out by a single shot. Tears threatened to rise again, but Jamal bit his lip hard, willing himself to stay quiet. The door creaked open, its harsh sound cutting through the silence. A uniformed officer stepped in, his face unreadable, holding Jamal's ID in one hand and a thin file in the other. "You get one phone call," the officer said flatly, dropping the ID on the table. His gaze barely lingered on Jamal before turning toward the door. Jamal nodded weakly, his hands shaking as he reached for the phone the officer placed before him. His fingers fumbled as he dialed his father's numbers he had known by heart since he was a child. The phone rang once, twice. Then Charles Carter's deep, steady voice filled the line. "Jamal, what is it?" His tone was sharp, instantly alert. The sound of his father's voice broke whatever strength Jamal had left. He tried to speak, but his words came out in a strangled sob. "Dad, they shot Max," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The officer said I tried to make him attack, but I didn't. I didn't do anything. I swear." The line fell silent for half a beat, and then Charles's voice returned, low and dangerous. "Where are you?" "At the police station," Jamal said softly, his tears returning now, unstoppable. "Dad, they said I provoked him. But Max was just barking. I couldn't stop him." "You listen to me," Charles said firmly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Stay where you are. I am coming to get you." The line clicked dead, and Jamal slowly set the phone back on the table. His father's words replayed in his mind. "I am coming to get you." He had heard that tone before, the same voice Charles used when he spoke about justice and accountability at his job. It brought a flicker of comfort, like a light cutting through the dark. Jamal sat back in the hard chair, his legs bouncing nervously as he waited. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every sound outside the room, the shuffle of papers, the murmur of voices, made his heart jump with hope that someone was coming for him. But no one did. Finally, the silence was shattered by the heavy, purposeful sound of footsteps. They grew louder, each step reverberating like a drumbeat of justice. Then, the sound of a deep, commanding voice echoed from the hallway, cutting through the usual low murmurs of the station. "Where is my son?" Jamal's heart lifted as his father's voice carried into the room. It was not loud, but it held a force that could stop anyone in their tracks. There was no mistaking that Charles Carter was a man to be reckoned with. The door to the holding room swung open, and Charles entered, his tall frame filling the doorway. Dressed in a sharp suit, his dark eyes scanned the room until they landed on Jamal. His expression softened slightly, but his anger simmered beneath the surface. "Are you all right, son?" Charles asked, his voice calm but heavy with restrained emotion. Jamal nodded weakly, but his eyes betrayed the weight of everything that had happened. "They said I made Max attack," he murmured. "But I didn't. Dad, I didn't." Charles's jaw tightened as he turned toward the officer standing just outside the door. "Who is in charge here?" he demanded. "And who arrested my son?" The officer looked startled, glancing down the hallway before mumbling, Captain Harris is on duty. I'll go get him." Charles stepped fully into the room, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. It was a firm, reassuring gesture, and for the first time since Max fell, Jamal felt like he was not alone. "We are going to get this sorted out," Charles said quietly. "I promise you." Minutes later, Captain Harris entered the room, a senior officer with graying hair and a cautious expression. He extended a hand to Charles, though the tension in the air was palpable. "Agent Carter," Captain Harris began, his tone even, "I apologize for the circumstances, but there seems to have been a misunderstanding." Officer Collins stated that. Charles held up a hand, cutting him off. "I know what Officer Collins said," he replied coldly. "And I also know my son. Jamal has never been in trouble a day in his life. I want to see the footage. Now." Captain Harris shifted uncomfortably. "There's no need for that." "There is a need," Charles interrupted, his voice firm. "You have a duty to get the facts right. Now show me the footage." The conference room where the CCTV footage was reviewed was small and dimly lit. The grainy black and white video flickered on the screen as Jamal sat beside his father, his heart pounding in his chest. The footage played silently, showing Jamal walking calmly down the sidewalk, Max trotting obediently beside him. Then, Officer Collins's cruiser pulled into the frame. The room fell silent as they watched the confrontation unfold. Even without sound, the body language was unmistakable. Officer Collins's aggressive stance, Jamal's confused gestures, and Max's calm, restrained behavior. Then came the moment Jamal issued a command, kneeling beside Max. The dog barked once, sharp and obedient. Officer Collins's response played out in stark, undeniable detail. He drew his weapon, his posture tense and defensive, and fired. Jamal flinched as he watched Max's body collapse to the pavement. He lowered his head, unable to keep looking. But Charles's expression remained frozen in place, his dark eyes locked on the screen. When the video stopped, the room fell into silence. Captain Harris cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable as he turned toward Charles. "This is not what Officer Collins described," Harris admitted, his voice low. Charles stood slowly, his presence commanding. "No, it is not," he said quietly, his tone dangerous in its calm. "What I see is a reckless overreaction. What I see is my son being treated like a criminal for no reason. That officer shot an innocent animal and traumatized my son. You tell me, how do you justify that?" Captain Harris did not have an answer. Jamal sat quietly, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. He felt a mixture of relief and anger boiling inside him. Relief that the truth was coming to light, but anger that it had come to this at all. Max was gone. Nothing would bring him back. Charles turned back to Captain Harris, his voice unwavering. "I want Officer Collins held accountable. I want a formal investigation into this incident, and most importantly, I want my son's name cleared." Captain Harris nodded reluctantly. "We will handle this properly," he said, his voice softer now. "You have my word." Charles placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder, guiding him out of the room. "Come on, son. We are going home." The ride home was quiet. Jamal stared out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by, though they no longer felt the same. The weight of grief hung heavy in his chest, threatening to crush him. When they pulled into the driveway, Jamal hesitated before getting out of the car. He looked over at his father, who sat silently with his hands on the steering wheel. "Dad?" Jamal's voice was barely above a whisper. Charles turned to him, his face softening. "Yeah? Do you think Max knew?" Jamal's voice broke, the tears returning. "Do you think he knew I loved him?" Charles reached over, squeezing Jamal's shoulder gently. "He knew," he said quietly. "Dogs always know." Jamal nodded, his heart aching as he stepped out of the car and into the stillness of their home. Max's empty leash lay on the counter, a painful reminder of everything he had lost. That night, Jamal lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The house felt empty again, and for the first time in a long time, he felt completely alone. But in the darkness, his father's words echoed in his mind. "We are going to get this sorted out." And somehow, deep in his chest, a small, flickering spark of hope remained. The morning sunlight streamed faintly through the living room blinds, but Jamal Carter barely noticed. He sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the old leather collar Mr. Henry Stevens had given him late the night before. It was worn and cracked in places, but sturdy like the kind Max would have grown into over time. He turned it over in his hands absent-mindedly, his mind trapped somewhere between grief and guilt. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Normally, mornings in the Carter household were filled with the sound of Charles making coffee, the radio playing low, and Jamal grabbing something quick before school. Today was different. It felt as though Max's absence echoed through every room. Jamal's chest tightened again as he thought of Max collapsing in that instant. How quick, how senseless it had been. The front door creaked open, and Charles stepped in, his face looking more worn than Jamal could remember. He had been out early, making calls and pushing the police department to move forward with the investigation. Despite the exhaustion in his father's posture, his steps were still steady, his presence solid as always. "Morning," Charles said quietly, setting his briefcase on the counter. He walked over and sat down across from Jamal. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on them both. "Captain Harris called this morning," Charles finally said, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "They are officially moving forward with the investigation into Officer Collins. The footage leaves no room for doubt." Jamal didn't look up, his fingers still turning the leather collar over and over in his hands. "It doesn't change what happened," he said softly. "No, it doesn't." Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But the truth matters, Jamal. You know that, and I will not let anyone turn you into something you are not." Jamal nodded faintly, though it was hard to believe. His mind kept replaying that moment on the sidewalk, the drawn gun, the sharp bark, the shot. The memory felt endless, like he was trapped inside of it. Charles watched his son carefully, recognizing the storm of emotions on his face. "Listen," Charles said gently. "This does not define you. What happened was not your fault. Do you hear me?" Jamal looked up finally, his red-rimmed eyes locking with his father's. "But it doesn't matter what I did or didn't do. Max is still gone, Dad. And I didn't protect him." "You did protect him," Charles replied firmly, his voice like a rock against the waves of Jamal's guilt. "You tried to calm him down. You kept your head when someone else lost theirs. You did everything you could." Jamal swallowed hard and nodded, though his heart still ached. Charles stood, his expression softening as he placed a steady hand on Jamal's shoulder. "There are still people out there who need to see the truth for what it is. Officer Collins's actions won't just disappear into a report somewhere. We are going to make sure of that." Later that afternoon, Jamal sat quietly in the passenger seat of his father's car as they drove toward the police station. Charles had asked Captain Harris for a meeting, and Jamal was both nervous and exhausted at the thought of going back. His father had insisted Jamal come along not as an act of punishment, but as a show of strength. "You have nothing to hide," Charles had told him. "Nothing to be ashamed of." They parked in front of the dull gray building. The sight of it made Jamal's stomach twist. He clenched his fists and took a slow breath as Charles got out of the car. "You, all right?" Charles asked as Jamal stepped out, shutting the door. "I guess," Jamal muttered. Inside, the station buzzed with activity phones rang, footsteps echoed, and officers moved about with paperwork and conversations. Jamal kept his head down as they made their way to Captain Harris's office. Some of the officers glanced at him as they passed, their expressions unreadable. Jamal tried not to look at them, though their eyes felt like a spotlight burning into his skin. Captain Harris's office was small but orderly, with a large desk and a row of filing cabinets against the wall. The captain himself sat behind the desk, looking weary and uncomfortable. He rose to shake Charles's hand, his tone polite but guarded. "Agent Carter," Harris said, "please have a seat." Charles nodded once, guiding Jamal to a chair before sitting down beside him. Harris took a deep breath before continuing. "I understand you wanted an update," he said. "The footage has been reviewed by my team, and I cannot dispute what it shows. Officer Collins overstepped his authority and used unnecessary force. He has been suspended pending further review." Charles's face remained hard, unreadable. "Suspended?" he repeated flatly. Harris shifted uneasily in his seat. "Yes, a full internal investigation will determine his final disciplinary action." "That is not enough," Charles replied sharply. "Suspension is a vacation. What that officer did traumatized my son and killed a defenseless animal. That kind of recklessness cannot be brushed under the rug." Harris sighed, looking older than his years. "I assure you, Agent Carter, this is being taken seriously. The footage will be part of the investigation, as well as any reports or witness statements." Charles did not waver. "I will hold you to that." Harris hesitated, then glanced toward Jamal. "Son," he said gently, his tone more cautious, "I want you to know we are sorry for what happened. I know that does not fix it, but—" Jamal looked up sharply, his voice raw but steady. "Sorry doesn't bring Max back." The words hung in the air like smoke. Harris nodded slowly, unable to argue. Charles stood, his tone clipped and final. "We will see how this plays out. But I expect action, Captain Harris, not words." On the drive home, the sun began to set, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and pink. Jamal leaned his head against the window, his thoughts heavy. He kept thinking about Max, his wagging tail, his bright eyes, the way he had barked so proudly in response to Jamal's commands. The silence in the car was almost soothing until Charles finally broke it. "You did well back there," Charles said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know this is hard, but you are handling yourself with more strength than you realize." Jamal didn't respond right away, staring at the houses passing by. "I just miss him," he whispered. "I keep thinking he's going to come running up to me, barking like he always did." Charles nodded, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "Losing someone you care about is never easy," he said. "But the pain reminds us of how much they mattered. Max mattered, Jamal, and his life will not be forgotten." They pulled into the driveway, and as they stepped inside, the house felt empty again. Jamal kicked off his shoes and wandered into the living room, where Max's old blanket still lay crumpled on the floor. Sitting down beside it, he picked it up, holding it close as tears stung his eyes. Then, a faint knock echoed from the front door. Charles opened it to reveal Mr. Henry Stevens, the elderly neighbor from down the street. He held a small, paper-wrapped package in his hands and smiled faintly. "I heard what happened," Mr. Stevens said softly. "Thought I would stop by. I know it is not much, but—" He glanced toward Jamal, his expression kind. "Sometimes small things help." Jamal looked up as Charles handed him the package. He unwrapped it slowly to find a framed photo, a simple picture of a German shepherd sitting proudly in the grass. The dog looked just like Max, his gaze loyal and steady. Tears welled in Jamal's eyes as he ran his fingers over the frame. "It was my old boy Rex," Mr. Stevens said gently. "He has been gone a while now, but I thought you might like this. You are not alone, son." For the first time in days, Jamal felt something other than grief, a small flicker of warmth, like sunlight breaking through the clouds. He looked up at Mr. Stevens, his voice choked but steady. "Thank you," Jamal said softly. Mr. Stevens nodded, his kind smile lingering. "Sometimes, when we lose the ones we love, we carry them with us by remembering." Jamal clutched the frame tightly, the ache in his chest shifting ever so slightly. Maybe Mr. Stevens was right. Maybe remembering was the first step toward healing. The days that followed felt heavy, like the air before a storm. Jamal carried Max's absence everywhere he went. It was there in the quiet house, in the empty backyard, and in the familiar streets where he used to walk his best friend. The framed photo Mr. Stevens had given him now sat on Jamal's nightstand. Each morning Jamal looked at it and whispered a small, "Good morning, Max," but it only made the ache in his chest feel sharper. At school, Jamal quickly realized that news of what had happened had spread farther than he expected. Whispers followed him down the halls like shadows. Some of his classmates avoided looking at him, while others stared outright. He could hear snippets of their conversations when they thought he wasn't listening. "That's the kid with the dog, right? I heard he sicked it on a cop." "No, that's not what happened. My brother said it was a mistake." "Well, why would the cop shoot the dog if nothing happened?" Jamal tried to block it all out, focusing on the rhythm of his footsteps as he walked to class. He kept his head down and avoided meeting anyone's eyes. Each whisper chipped away at the thin wall he had built around himself. He wanted to scream the truth, to shout that Max was innocent, that he was innocent, but the words stayed trapped in his chest, burning like fire. At lunchtime, Jamal found his usual table near the back of the cafeteria. He pulled out a sandwich his father had packed that morning, though he wasn't hungry. The cafeteria buzzed with noise, but Jamal felt like he was sitting in a bubble, separate from everyone else. "Hey, hey!" The voice startled him, and he looked up to see Sarah Johnson standing there, her tray balanced in one hand. Sarah wasn't someone Jamal talked to much, though he knew her from a couple of classes. She was one of those people who seemed to float through school quietly, never getting too involved, but always noticing what was going on. Her expression was hesitant, but her eyes were kind. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked. Jamal blinked, caught off guard. Sure," he mumbled, shrugging. Sarah sat down across from him, setting her tray down. For a moment she didn't say anything, just picked at her salad with a plastic fork. Jamal kept his eyes on his sandwich, waiting for her to speak. "I heard what happened," she said finally, her voice soft but clear. Jamal tensed slightly. "Yeah?" he replied, his tone neutral. Sarah nodded. "My dad's a lawyer. He showed me an article about it last night. Your dog didn't deserve that." I'm sorry, Jamal." Jamal froze. He wasn't sure what he had been expecting, maybe more whispers or pitying looks, but not this, not kindness. He looked up at her, searching her face for any sign that she was mocking him, but all he saw was sincerity. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then added, "People are going to talk no matter what, but you don't have to listen to them. You know what really happened? That matters." Jamal nodded slowly, her words sinking in. It was such a simple thing for her to say, but it chipped away at the loneliness that had been building inside him. For the first time since that awful day, he felt like someone saw him not as a story or a rumor, but as a person. That evening, Jamal sat at the kitchen table while Charles paced nearby, his phone pressed to his ear. The sound of Charles's measured but firm voice filled the room as he spoke with Captain Harris about the investigation. Jamal sipped quietly on a glass of water, his thoughts distant. The framed photo of Max seemed to watch him from its place in the living room. Charles hung up with a heavy sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. "They are still reviewing the footage and Officer Collins' statement," he said, more to himself than to Jamal. "Harris says they are moving as quickly as they can, but it's not quick enough." Jamal set his glass down carefully. "Does it matter?" he asked softly. Charles turned to look at him. "Of course, it matters." "But Max is still gone," Jamal replied, his voice hollow. "No matter what happens to that officer, it won't bring him back." Charles walked over and sat down across from his son. "No, it won't," he admitted. "But it's not just about Max anymore. What happened to him was wrong, Jamal. What happened to you was wrong. And if we let that go without demanding accountability, it could happen to someone else. Jamal stared down at the table, considering his father's words. The anger that had been simmering inside him felt like a weight one he didn't know how to carry. I just want people to stop talking about me, he muttered. I don't want to be the kid they whisper about. Charles nodded slowly. I understand, he said. But sometimes standing up for what's right means letting people see you, letting them see the truth. Before Jamal could reply, there was a knock at the door. Charles stood to answer it, and Jamal could hear a familiar voice from the hallway. Moments later, Charles returned with Mr. Henry Stevens, the elderly neighbor who had given Jamal the collar. Evening, Jamal, Mr. Stevens said with a small smile. He carried a folded newspaper in his hand and held it out. Thought you might want to see this. Jamal took the paper carefully and unfolded it. The headline on the local news page jumped out at him. Shot fired. Police action against teen sparks questions. The article was written by a journalist named Maya Thompson. Jamal skimmed the opening lines, his eyes widening as he read, An incident involving a local teenager and his dog has brought growing concerns over the use of force and accountability within the police department. Footage of the event shows 18-year-old Jamal Carter walking his dog, Max, when Officer Ray Collins confronted him in what appeared to be an escalation without justification. The words blurred slightly as Jamal read on. The article recounted the events of that day with striking accuracy, drawing on the CCTV footage and witness reports. It was the first time Jamal had seen his story told plainly, without rumors or assumptions. Maya's words were direct but compassionate, calling for answers and accountability. Jamal looked up at Mr. Stevens, his voice quiet. How did she know all this? She's good at her job, Mr. Stevens replied with a shrug. And people are starting to pay attention. You are not alone in this, Jamal? Charles nodded, his expression thoughtful. This is the first step, he said. The truth is coming out, son. Jamal set the paper down carefully, his mind spinning. He still felt raw, still missed Max so deeply it hurt, but seeing his story told gave him a flicker of hope. Maybe his father was right. Maybe the truth did matter. The next morning, Jamal stood on the front porch, holding the newspaper in his hands. He looked out across the quiet street, his thoughts racing. For days, he had felt trapped, defined by what had happened, defined by his grief. But Sarah's words echoed in his mind. People will talk no matter what. You know what really happened? That matters. Mr. Stevens's quiet kindness. Maya's article. His father's resolve. They were all threads in something bigger, a fight Jamal had not asked for, but one he now realized he could not walk away from. He looked down at the photo of Max framed in his mind, his best friend. Gone, but not forgotten. Max had been loyal to him, standing by his side no matter what. Maybe now it was Jamal's turn to stand up not just for himself, but for Max, for the truth, and for anyone else who might feel alone. Jamal took a deep breath, feeling the weight in his chest shift just slightly. His grief was still there, still sharp, but beneath it, something new began to grow. Resolve. The morning air felt sharp against Jamal's skin as he stood on the front porch, his gaze drifting across the stillness of the neighborhood. The wind tugged gently at the corners of his sweatshirt, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, on Maya Thompson's article, on the whispers at school, and most of all, on Max. His fingers traced the edge of the newspaper he had folded into his pocket, the headlines still etched in his mind. Shot fired, police action against teen sparks questions. The article was out there now. People knew the truth, or at least enough of it, to start asking questions. Jamal wished it brought him more relief. Instead, it felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane, quiet, but with the storm still circling him on all sides. Inside, his father was already moving through his usual morning routine. Charles's movements were sharp and purposeful as he prepared for the day, his phone constantly buzzing with calls. To Jamal, it felt like his father was carrying the weight of two people, their grief for Max and the fight for justice. "Jamal," Charles called from the kitchen. "Grab your things. I'll drop you off at school." Jamal hesitated at the door. He knew what waited for him there. The looks, the whispers, the weight of being the center of a story he had no control over. But as he glanced back at the framed photo of Max on the living room shelf, something in him steadied. He couldn't hide forever. He wouldn't let people rewrite the truth of what happened. "All right," Jamal muttered, grabbing his backpack. As expected, school was harder than usual. Every hallway felt longer, every step heavier. By the time lunch rolled around, Jamal was ready to retreat, find an empty corner of the library where no one would look for him. But when he entered the cafeteria, there she was again, Sarah Johnson. She was sitting at the same table as before, waiting, as though she had known he would show up. Jamal froze for a moment, unsure. Part of him still expected people's kindness to come with strings attached. But then Sarah looked up, caught his eye, and gave him the smallest smile. It was a simple, quiet thing, but it cut through the noise in Jamal's mind. "Hey," she said when he approached. "You eating?" "Not really hungry," Jamal admitted, sliding his bag onto the bench. Sarah nodded like she understood. She picked at her salad quietly, then looked up again. "I read the article." Jamal tensed, his jaw tightening. "Yeah?" "It was good," Sarah said. "The reporter, Maya, she got it right. She made sure people saw what really happened." She hesitated, then added softly, "It's not easy to be in the middle of something like this, but you are handling it better than most people would." Jamal shook his head, his voice low. "It doesn't feel that way." Sarah tilted her head slightly. "You are still here, Jamal. That counts for something." He looked at her, surprised by the matter-of-fact tone in her voice. There was no pity in her expression, only honesty. For so long, Jamal had felt like everything was spiraling out of control. But here was Sarah, calm, steady, seeing him for who he really was. Jamal sighed, leaning back against the bench. "Thanks," he said quietly. Sarah shrugged. "No big deal. Sometimes people just need to hear it." For the rest of lunch, they talked about other things: teachers, classes, music. It was the first normal conversation Jamal had had in what felt like forever, and though it didn't erase the weight he was carrying, it lightened it just a little. Later that day, Jamal found himself walking home alone. His father had been called into work unexpectedly, so he decided to take the long route through the neighborhood. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves on the trees. As he walked past Mr. Stevens's house, Jamal noticed the older man on his porch, rocking gently in an old wooden chair. "Afternoon, Jamal," Mr. Stevens called out, his voice warm. Jamal stopped, turning toward him. "Hey, Mr. Stevens?" "Long day?" the older man asked, leaning forward slightly. Jamal shrugged. "Something like that." Mr. Stevens nodded knowingly and gestured to the empty chair next to him. "Sit for a minute. I could use the company." Jamal hesitated, then walked up the steps and lowered himself into the creaky chair. It swayed slightly under his weight, and for a moment the silence between them felt like a comfort. "Been reading that article again, huh?" Mr. Stevens asked after a moment. Jamal glanced at him, surprised. "How did you know?" The old man chuckled softly. "I was young once, too. When something big happens, it feels like you need to keep looking at it, like it'll make more sense if you stare long enough." Jamal looked down at his hands. "It's not fair," he said finally. "Max didn't deserve what happened, and no matter how many people see that article, he is still gone." Mr. Stevens nodded, his face somber. "It isn't fair, Jamal. The world doesn't always play fair, but we have a choice in how we respond to it." He paused, his eyes thoughtful. You know, after my wife passed, I didn't think I would get through it. Then I found Rex, my old German shepherd. He gave me something to hold on to, something to keep me moving forward. Jamal stared at him, listening intently. When Rex passed a few years back, Mr. Stevens continued, I thought the loss would break me all over again. But I realized something important, our loved ones. They leave pieces of themselves with us, the way they made us feel, the lessons they taught us. Even when they are gone, those pieces stay. Jamal swallowed hard, his chest tightening. Max was my best friend. And he still is, Mr. Stevens said gently. He stood by you because you mattered to him. You can carry that with you, Jamal. Honor him by holding on to the good parts. Jamal didn't say anything for a long moment. He felt the sting of tears in his eyes, but blinked them back, turning his gaze to the street. Mr. Stevens's words settled deep inside him, like stones tossed into still water, sending ripples of thought through his mind. The older man patted Jamal's shoulder lightly, a gesture of quiet reassurance. You are stronger than you think, kid. You'll see. That night, as Jamal sat on his bed, he pulled out the framed photo of Max and held it in his hands. He thought about Mr. Stevens's words that Max had left a part of himself behind. Jamal remembered the way Max would nuzzle his hand when he felt sad, or sit at his feet quietly when the world felt too loud. Max had always been there for him. Maybe I can do something for him now, Jamal thought. The idea came softly, like a whisper. It wasn't fully formed, but it planted itself in Jamal's mind. He would find a way to honor Max, to make sure his dog's memory wasn't defined by what had happened that day. Maybe it was through speaking the truth. Maybe it was through helping others who felt alone, like he had. For the first time since the shooting, Jamal felt a spark of purpose begin to flicker inside him. He still hurt. He still missed Max so much, it felt like a weight pressing on his chest, but for the first time, he believed he could carry it. Before turning off the light, Jamal whispered quietly into the stillness of the room, I miss you, Max. But I promise I'll make this right. And as he lay back against his pillow, he felt something shift deep within him, like the first ray of sunlight breaking through a dark, endless storm. The next morning, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds, as though the weather itself understood the weight in Jamal's heart. He sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly poking at the scrambled eggs Charles had made for him. His father stood across the room, speaking quietly into his phone. Charles's voice was calm and collected, as always, but the sharp edge underneath told Jamal everything he needed to know. His father was still pushing, still making sure the investigation into Officer Collins did not get buried. Jamal appreciated his father's resolve, but it did not stop the ache in his chest. He still saw Max every time he closed his eyes. He still felt the emptiness when he woke up each morning, expecting to hear paws tapping softly against the floor. The house was too quiet without him. Jamal, Charles said, tucking his phone into his pocket. His voice was gentler when he addressed his son. You doing all right? Jamal looked up briefly before staring back down at his plate. Yeah, he muttered, though it was clear he wasn't. Charles walked over and sat down across from him, setting his hands on the table. Listen, son. I know you are hurting. I know this is hard, but it is important to take care of yourself too. Jamal sighed. I just keep thinking about Max, about that day. I should have done more. Charles shook his head firmly. You need to let go of that, Jamal. What happened to Max was not your fault. That officer was the one who escalated the situation. You were just a kid walking his dog. Jamal looked up at his father, searching his face for something answers, maybe, or reassurance. It just feels like I failed him. Charles held his gaze. You did not fail him. Max loved you, and you honored that love every day you had with him. The words settled over Jamal, soft but heavy, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe them. That afternoon, Charles left for work, and Jamal found himself restless. The quiet house felt suffocating, so he grabbed his jacket and decided to take a walk. He had no real destination in mind, just the need to move, to breathe. The wind had picked up, tugging at the edges of his clothes as he made his way down the street. He passed the house with the faded blue shutters where Mr. Stevens lived, and as if on cue, the old man appeared on the porch, bundled up against the chill. "Afternoon, Jamal," Mr. Stevens called, his voice warm despite the cold air. "Hey, Mr. Stevens," Jamal replied, slowing his steps. "Got somewhere you're headed, or just wandering?" "Just wandering," Jamal admitted, with a small shrug. "Well, come with me then," Mr. Stevens said, pushing himself up from the rocking chair. "I was about to head to the shelter. Could use some company." "The shelter?" Jamal asked, his brow furrowing. "Animal shelter," Mr. Stevens clarified. "I volunteer a few days a week. Keeps me busy." Jamal hesitated. The idea of seeing other dogs made his chest tighten, but Mr. Stevens's invitation had a quiet sincerity that was hard to refuse. "Sure," Jamal said finally. "I'll come with you." The local animal shelter sat on the edge of town, a squat building with a fenced-in yard where dogs barked and ran freely. Jamal followed Mr. Stevens inside, his hands tucked into his pockets as they stepped into a small reception area that smelled faintly of disinfectant and dog food. A young woman behind the desk greeted them warmly. "Back again, Mr. Stevens?" "Of course," Mr. Stevens replied with a smile. "I brought someone to help out today. This is Jamal." The woman turned to Jamal, her expression kind. "Nice to meet you, Jamal. I'm Lisa. We could definitely use the extra hands. Come on, let's get you settled." Jamal followed Lisa and Mr. Stevens into the back of the shelter, where rows of kennels stretched along the walls. Dogs of all shapes and sizes peered out through the metal bars, some wagging their tails eagerly, others lying curled up in the corners. The sounds of barking and whining filled the air, but to Jamal, it was almost comforting, a reminder that life still moved on. "Most of these dogs are waiting for homes," Lisa explained as they walked. "Some are strays, some were surrendered by their owners. We do what we can to make sure they're loved while they're here." Jamal's gaze drifted over the dogs as they passed. There was a shaggy black and white mutt that jumped up against the kennel door, barking playfully. A small, timid terrier huddled in the back, watching them with wide eyes. Then, as they turned the corner, Jamal stopped short. In the last kennel, a young German shepherd sat quietly, his ears perked and his head tilted slightly to the side. His coat was darker than Max's had been, but his eyes were the same, bright, loyal, and watchful. "That's Shadow," Lisa said softly, noticing Jamal's reaction. "He came in a few weeks ago. He's young, still a puppy, but he's smart. A little shy at first, but once he trusts you, he's all yours." Jamal crouched down in front of the kennel, his heart twisting. Shadow watched him for a moment before walking closer, his nose pressed against the bars as if trying to get a better look. Tentatively, Jamal reached his hand forward, and to his surprise, Shadow licked his fingers gently. It was a small gesture, but it sent a warmth through Jamal's chest that he hadn't felt in days. "You can take him out if you want," Lisa offered. Jamal hesitated, his fingers still resting against the bars. "I don't know," he murmured. "I'm not sure I'm ready." Mr. Stevens, who had been watching quietly, stepped forward. "You do not have to be ready all at once, Jamal," he said gently. "But sometimes, taking a step helps more than you think." Lisa opened the kennel door, and Shadow trotted out cautiously, his tail wagging in slow, tentative arcs. Jamal sat back on his heels as the dog approached, sniffing him curiously before nudging his hand with his nose. The movement was so familiar, so gentle, that Jamal couldn't stop the small smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Hey there, Shadow," he whispered, running a hand over the pup's back. Shadow pressed against him, his tail wagging a little faster now. For the first time in days, Jamal felt something loosen in his chest, like a knot slowly unraveling. "You remind me of someone," Jamal added softly. By the time Jamal and Mr. Stevens left the shelter, the gray clouds had begun to break apart, streaks of sunlight piercing through the gaps. Jamal walked a little slower, his thoughts still lingering on Shadow. There was something about the dog that stayed with him, something that felt both painful and comforting. Mr. Stevens walked beside him in silence for a while before speaking. "You know, Jamal, you don't have to carry all this alone." Jamal glanced at him, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Mr. Stevens smiled faintly. "Grief has a way of making us feel like we're the only ones who understand it. But you have people who care about you, your dad, that reporter, Sarah from school. And you've got me too, if you ever need someone to talk to." Jamal looked down at the sidewalk, his hands tucked deep into his jacket pockets. "It just feels like no one gets it," he admitted quietly. "Max wasn't just a dog. He was everything." "I know," Mr. Stevens said gently, "but Max wouldn't want you to carry this pain forever. Sometimes the best way to honor those we have lost is to keep moving forward, to give that love we had for them to someone else who needs it." Jamal thought about Shadow, about the way the young German shepherd had nudged his hand and wagged his tail. Maybe Mr. Stevens was right. Maybe there was room in his heart for something new, even if the ache for Max never fully disappeared. As they turned onto their street, Jamal looked up at the sky. The last of the clouds had cleared, leaving it bright and open. He let out a slow breath, feeling lighter than he had in days. The following days passed in slow, quiet steps. Jamal could not stop thinking about Shadow, the way the dog had looked at him, the quiet understanding in his eyes, and the gentle nudge of his nose against Jamal's hand. It felt like standing at the edge of something important, like a door creaking open to a room Jamal was not sure he was ready to enter. But every day since visiting the shelter, Mr. Stevens would check in on him. A soft knock on the door, a quick wave from the porch, or an offer to stop by the shelter again. Each moment of kindness felt like a lifeline, pulling Jamal out of the weight he had been carrying. It was on a bright Friday morning, the kind of morning where the air smelled like spring, and the sunlight warmed the sidewalks, that Jamal's father finally shared some news. Charles stood in the kitchen, his dark suit pressed perfectly, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. Jamal sat at the table, toying with the corner of his toast, the newspaper folded nearby. "They are holding a hearing," Charles said suddenly, his tone sharp but calm. "Officer Collins's suspension is being reviewed by an independent panel. The department cannot ignore the footage any longer." Jamal looked up quickly, surprised. "A hearing? What does that mean?" "It means that people are watching," Charles replied firmly. "The department cannot just sweep this under the rug. The panel will hear the evidence, review the video, and make recommendations about what happens next. I have already been asked to testify." Jamal's stomach twisted nervously. "You are going to speak?" Charles nodded. "I am, and I think you should too." Jamal froze, the toast halfway to his mouth. "Me?" he said softly, his voice uncertain. Charles walked over and sat down across from him, his expression steady but gentle. "Son, I know this is hard. I know you did not ask for any of this, but your voice matters. People need to hear the truth, not just from me, not just from Maya's article, but from you. You are the one who lost Max. You are the one who was there." Jamal looked down at the table, his fingers tightening around the edge of his plate. The thought of standing in front of people, of speaking about Max, about that day, it felt like exposing his wounds for everyone to see. But something in his father's words stayed with him. "Your voice matters." "What if I mess it up?" Jamal asked quietly. Charles reached over, placing a firm hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You won't. You just have to tell the truth." The hearing was held at the local town hall the following week. It was a large, square building, made of red brick with wide stone steps that led up to double doors. Jamal stood outside with his father, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, his heart pounding in his chest. There were people everywhere, news reporters with cameras, police officers in crisp uniforms, and members of the community murmuring in quiet clusters. Jamal recognized a few faces in the crowd. Maya Thompson, the reporter who had written the article, waved to him briefly. Mr. Stevens stood farther back, leaning on his cane, his sharp eyes watching the scene unfold. Sarah Johnson was there too, standing with a group of classmates. She gave Jamal a small smile that made his chest tighten. "Ready?" Charles asked, his voice quiet but steady. Jamal swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, I think so." They stepped inside together, the air cooler and quieter in the wide, high-ceilinged room. Wooden benches lined the sides, and at the front sat a long table where members of the independent panel were already seated. Officer Collins sat on the other side of the room, his expression blank, his posture stiff. Jamal looked at him briefly, before quickly looking away. The hearing began with Captain Harris presenting the details of the case. He spoke carefully, his tone professional but measured, as though he knew how serious the matter was. He showed the CCTV footage again, grainy but unmistakable. The panel members watched in silence, their faces hard and unreadable. Jamal kept his head down as the footage played. He did not want to see it again. He had already memorized every second, every movement, every sound. "Charles Carter," the panel leader called out when the video ended. "Please come forward." Jamal watched as his father stood, his tall frame calm and unshakable as he approached the table. Charles spoke clearly and firmly, recounting the events from the moment Jamal had called him from the holding room to the review of the footage. Every word was measured, every sentence direct. Charles did not waver, his voice filled with the quiet power that Jamal had always admired. "My son is not a criminal," Charles concluded, his gaze sweeping across the panel. "He was walking his dog, his own dog. Officer Collins profiled him, escalated the situation, and made a choice that cost a young boy his best friend. That is the truth. And the truth matters." A murmur rippled through the room, and the panel members nodded solemnly. Charles returned to his seat beside Jamal, his expression firm. "Next, we will hear from Jamal Carter," the panel leader announced. Jamal's heart jumped into his throat. For a moment, he froze. The room felt too big, too quiet. Then he felt his father's hand on his shoulder, steady and reassuring. "You have got this," Charles said softly. Jamal stood slowly, his legs shaky as he walked to the front of the room. The panel members watched him carefully, their eyes kind but serious. Jamal could feel the weight of every person's gaze, but as he turned slightly, he caught sight of Mr. Stevens near the back of the room. The old man nodded once, his expression calm. Sarah was watching too, her face filled with quiet encouragement. Jamal took a deep breath and began. "That day, I was just walking my dog," he said, his voice soft at first but growing steadier with each word. "Max was my best friend. My dad gave him to me for my birthday. I trained him. I took care of him. He was mine." He paused, his throat tightening, but he pushed through. "When Officer Collins stopped me, I didn't know why. I tried to explain, but he didn't believe me. Max barked once, just once, because I told him to sit. He was a good dog. He was just trying to protect me, because he could tell I was scared. And then—" Jamal swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "And then he was gone." The room was silent. Jamal's voice broke slightly as he continued. "Max didn't deserve what happened. I didn't deserve what happened. I lost my best friend that day, and I will never forget him." When he finished, the room remained quiet. Jamal looked up slowly, surprised to see that the panel members were watching him with expressions of quiet understanding. One of them, an older woman with kind eyes, nodded gently, as though to say, "We hear you." Jamal returned to his seat beside his father. Charles gave him a small nod, his pride evident in the way he sat up straighter. "You did good, son," he whispered. The hearing ended hours later, and as Jamal and Charles walked down the steps of the town hall, a small crowd had gathered outside. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. Reporters held out microphones, shouting questions, but Charles guided Jamal past them, his arm firm around his son's shoulders. Near the edge of the crowd, Jamal spotted Mr. Stevens waiting with a proud smile. Beside him was Maya Thompson, her notepad in hand. "You spoke well today, Jamal," Maya said as they approached. "People needed to hear your story." Jamal nodded quietly. "Thank you for helping tell it." Maya smiled faintly. "The truth deserves to be told." Mr. Stevens placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You did more than you know today, kid. Max would be proud." Jamal swallowed hard, the ache in his chest still there, but lighter now, as though a small part of the weight had been lifted. He looked back at the town hall, where people were still streaming out, talking quietly among themselves. Maybe Mr. Stevens is right, Jamal thought. Maybe telling the truth really does matter. As they walked back toward the car, the sun finally broke through the clouds, warming Jamal's face. It felt like a quiet promise, one he knew he would carry forward. The days following the hearing felt different, not entirely lighter, but changed somehow. For the first time since that awful afternoon, Jamal felt like he had taken control of something. Standing up and telling the truth about Max had been one of the hardest things he had ever done. But afterward, there had been a quiet sense of release, as if the weight he had been carrying had started to shift. Still, the grief lingered. It hung like a shadow that moved with him, soft but persistent. Jamal often found himself staring at the framed photo of Max on his nightstand. Some nights, when the house was quiet and the darkness pressed in, he would whisper things to Max, things he had not said before. Promises, regrets, memories. One morning, Jamal sat at the kitchen table, staring into a bowl of cereal he had barely touched. Charles had already left for work, his parting words as steady as ever. "Stay strong, son. One step at a time." Jamal appreciated his father's faith in him, but some days it still felt hard to move forward. The sound of a knock on the front door broke through Jamal's thoughts. He frowned, glancing toward the clock. It was still too early for a visitor. Pushing himself up from the table, he walked to the door and opened it to find Mr. Stevens standing there, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn coat, and a small smile on his face. "Morning, Jamal," the older man said. "Hope I'm not bothering you." Jamal shook his head. "No, not at all. What's up?" "Well," Mr. Stevens said, rocking back on his heels, "I was on my way to the shelter and thought you might like to come along. Get out of the house, stretch your legs. What do you say?" Jamal hesitated. He had not been back to the shelter since the day he met Shadow. The thought of seeing all those dogs again, of being surrounded by reminders of Max, made his chest tighten. But then he thought of Shadow, of the way the puppy had nudged his hand, the way his tail had wagged slowly, as if waiting for Jamal to trust him. That memory lingered. "Sure," Jamal said finally. "I'll come." The shelter was quiet when they arrived, the early hour keeping visitors away. Lisa greeted them warmly as they stepped inside, her smile as bright as Jamal remembered. "Hey, Mr. Stevens," she said. Then turning to Jamal, "Nice to see you again, Jamal. I'm glad you came back." Jamal nodded, offering a small smile in return. He followed Lisa and Mr. Stevens to the back, where the rows of kennels stretched along the walls. The familiar sounds of barking filled the air, but this time they did not overwhelm him. Jamal glanced at each dog as he passed, their eager eyes and wagging tails reminding him that there was still so much life here. As they rounded the corner, Jamal's heart jumped slightly when he saw Shadow sitting in the same kennel. The puppy looked up at him immediately, his ears perking and his tail thumping softly against the floor. For a moment, Jamal just stared at him, the same mixture of pain and warmth bubbling up inside him. Lisa must have noticed. "Shadow has been waiting for you, I think," she said gently. Jamal crouched down in front of the kennel, his fingers brushing against the bars. Shadow trotted over without hesitation this time, pressing his nose against Jamal's hand like they were already old friends. "Want to take him out for a bit?" Lisa asked. Jamal hesitated, his chest tightening. "I don't know." Mr. Stevens spoke up from behind him. "You do not have to decide anything today, Jamal," he said quietly. "But give it a try. See how it feels." Jamal looked back at Shadow, who was watching him with those same bright, trusting eyes. After a moment, he nodded. "Okay." Lisa opened the kennel door, clipping a leash onto Shadow's collar before handing it to Jamal. The puppy bounced forward eagerly, his tail wagging with excitement. Jamal felt a pang in his chest as he held the leash in his hands, but he took a deep breath and stood, leading Shadow out into the fenced yard behind the shelter. The backyard was quiet, save for the sound of the wind rustling the trees and the faint hum of traffic from the road nearby. Jamal let Shadow off the leash, and the puppy took off immediately, bounding through the grass with the energy only a young dog could have. Jamal watched him, his heart twisting in that familiar way. But this time, the ache was softer. Shadow turned back after a moment, his tongue lolling out as he trotted toward Jamal. He plopped down in front of him, tilting his head to the side like he was waiting for something. "You remind me of him, you know," Jamal said softly, crouching down. "Max, he would have liked you." Shadow nudged Jamal's knee with his nose, his tail swishing across the grass. Jamal reached out hesitantly, running a hand over the puppy's back. Shadow stayed perfectly still, his head resting against Jamal's knee. The small, quiet gesture hit Jamal in a way he hadn't expected. It felt like the puppy understood not just the loss, but the emptiness that had followed it. "I miss him," Jamal whispered, his voice barely audible. Shadow licked his hand softly, and something inside Jamal cracked, like ice thawing after a long, harsh winter. He let out a slow breath and sat back in the grass, Shadow curling up beside him as if he had known Jamal his whole life. The yard was quiet again, but this time it felt peaceful. After a while, Mr. Stevens appeared in the doorway of the shelter, watching them with a knowing smile. "Looks like he chose you, Jamal." Jamal looked up, surprised. "Chose me?" Mr. Stevens chuckled. "Dogs do that sometimes. They find the people who need them most." Jamal looked back down at Shadow, who was still curled up against his side. The puppy's breathing was slow and steady, like he knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Jamal ran a hand over his back again, this time feeling a small, hesitant warmth spread through his chest. Later that evening, Jamal sat on the couch beside his father, Shadow lying peacefully on the floor at his feet. They had brought him home that afternoon, a simple blue collar wrapped snugly around his neck. Jamal had not been sure about the decision at first, but as he watched Shadow trot through the house, exploring every corner with curiosity, it had felt right. Charles looked over at Jamal, his brow raised. "He's settling in fast." "Yeah," Jamal replied softly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "He seems like he belongs here." Charles nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm proud of you, son. Bringing Shadow home, that took courage." Jamal looked down at the puppy, who was now fast asleep, his body curled up tightly. "I'm not replacing Max," he said quietly. "I could never do that." Charles's voice was gentle. "You are not replacing him, Jamal. You are giving yourself room to heal." Jamal nodded, his fingers brushing against Shadow's fur. He thought of Max, of all the good memories they had shared. The ache of his loss was still there, but it no longer felt like it would crush him. Instead, it felt like a part of him, something he could carry with him as he moved forward. Shadow shifted in his sleep, letting out a soft, contented sigh. Jamal smiled faintly, the first real smile in what felt like a long time. "I think Max would be okay with this," Jamal whispered, more to himself than anyone else. And in that moment, as the house filled with the quiet sounds of breathing and the hum of the heater, Jamal allowed himself to believe it. The house felt different with Shadow in it. Not in a loud or chaotic way. Shadow was still a puppy, but he seemed to sense the quiet, steady rhythm of the Carter home. He followed Jamal everywhere, his paws clicking softly against the hardwood floors. At night, Shadow curled up at the foot of Jamal's bed, and the room, which had once felt so empty, began to feel just a little fuller. Jamal still missed Max, but having Shadow around was like filling part of the hole Max had left behind. It did not erase the loss, but it softened the sharp edges, giving Jamal something to hold on to. On Saturday morning, Mr. Stevens showed up at the door again, this time holding a box filled with supplies, dog toys, treats, a bright blue leash, and a bowl with Shadow's name painted carefully on the side. Jamal looked down at the items, his brow furrowing in surprise. "Did you—" "Let's just call it a welcome gift," Mr. Stevens said, grinning. "Shadow deserves a proper start here." Jamal smiled faintly, running his fingers over the bowl. "Thanks, Mr. Stevens." The old man nodded, his voice softening. "I told you once before, kid, when we lose someone we love, we carry them with us. That does not mean we stop living. Shadow's going to help you move forward, just like Max would want you to." Jamal looked down at Shadow, who sat obediently at his feet, wagging his tail as if he understood. Something about Mr. Stevens's words stuck with Jamal, a quiet reminder of the strength he was beginning to find in the kindness of those around him. Later that afternoon, Jamal and his father drove into town. The local animal shelter was hosting a small community event, a fundraiser for food and supplies, and Mr. Stevens had invited them to come along. Jamal was not sure why he had agreed to go. Part of him still felt raw, but another part, the part that had begun to mend, wanted to help. Maybe there were other dogs like Shadow who needed someone to care about them. When they arrived, the shelter yard was already filled with people, families with kids, volunteers in matching t-shirts, and local businesses setting up small booths. Lisa, the shelter coordinator, waved at Jamal as soon as she spotted him. "Glad you made it," she called. Jamal walked beside Charles, holding tightly to Shadow's new leash. The puppy trotted beside him, sniffing eagerly at everything: blades of grass, people's shoes, even the base of the tables. Jamal smiled despite himself. "This was a good idea," Charles said quietly as they walked toward the main shelter table, where Mr. Stevens was setting up boxes of supplies. "Yeah," Jamal replied, nodding. "It feels good to be here." "Jamal!" He turned at the sound of his name and saw Sarah Johnson weaving her way through the crowd toward him. She wore a bright green volunteer t-shirt with the shelter's logo on the front, her ponytail swaying as she walked. "You made it," Sarah said, grinning. Then her eyes fell on Shadow, and her expression softened. "Is this him?" "Yeah," Jamal replied, glancing down at the puppy. "This is Shadow." Sarah crouched down, holding out her hand so Shadow could sniff her. The puppy wagged his tail and nudged her hand gently, earning a laugh from Sarah. "He's adorable," she said, looking up at Jamal. "I'm glad you brought him home. He looks happy." Jamal nodded, a small smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, I think he is." As Sarah stood, she gestured toward a small table at the far end of the yard. "We're doing a raffle to raise money for the shelter. You should check it out. Mr. Stevens said you might want to help out today." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "He did?" Sarah smirked. "He did. You know, he talks about you like your family." Jamal looked over at Mr. Stevens, who was busy chatting with a group of people near the supply bins. The old man caught Jamal's eye and gave him a quick nod, as if to say, "You've got this." "Come on," Sarah said, tugging his arm lightly. "I'll show you what to do." Over the next few hours, Jamal found himself more involved than he expected. Sarah showed him how to organize the raffle table, collect donations, and help families looking to adopt pets. At first, Jamal felt awkward. He had never been comfortable talking to strangers, but as the day wore on, he realized how good it felt to be part of something. One moment in particular stuck with him. A young boy with curly blonde hair and wide eyes approached Jamal, his hand wrapped tightly around his mother's. The boy pointed at a scruffy gray terrier sitting in one of the pens. "Can I pet him?" the boy asked, his voice hesitant. Jamal crouched down beside the pen, glancing up at the mother for permission. She nodded, and Jamal slowly opened the gate. "Be gentle," he said softly, as the terrier padded out. "He's still a little shy." The boy reached out a hand, his face lighting up when the dog licked his fingers. "He likes me," Jamal smiled, watching the boy's excitement. The terrier wagged its tail, pressing its small body against the boy's legs. "Dogs know good people when they see them," Jamal said quietly. The boy looked up at Jamal, his expression serious. "Did you have a dog?" Jamal's heart tightened. "Yeah," he replied softly. "I did." "Was he nice like this one?" Jamal nodded, his throat tight. "He was the best." The boy smiled again, completely absorbed in the terrier now. As Jamal watched them, a warmth spread through his chest. He could see the boy falling in love with the dog, just like he had fallen in love with Max. Maybe Mr. Stevens was right. Maybe helping others gave you a way to carry your own pain. By the end of the afternoon, the fundraiser had raised more money than the shelter had expected. Jamal stood near the parking lot with Charles and Mr. Stevens, watching families leave with wagging tails and excited children. Shadow sat obediently at his feet, his ears perked up as he watched everything happening around him. "You did good today, kid," Mr. Stevens said, clapping Jamal lightly on the shoulder. "Real good." Jamal glanced up at the older man, his voice quiet but steady. "Thanks. It felt nice to help." Charles nodded approvingly. "You made a difference here today, Jamal. That matters." Jamal looked down at Shadow, who nudged his hand gently with his nose. The puppy's bright, trusting eyes reminded Jamal of the promise he had made to honor Max's memory by moving forward. He had taken small steps, but they were stepping all the same. As they drove home, the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the car windows, casting golden streaks across the dashboard. Jamal rested his hand lightly on Shadow's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of the puppy's breathing. For the first time in weeks, Jamal allowed himself to believe that things were going to be okay. Max would always be part of him, but Shadow was teaching him how to heal, one small moment at a time. The golden hues of late afternoon sunlight filled Jamal's room, stretching long shadows across the floor. Shadow lay curled near the window, his body rising and falling in a gentle rhythm as he napped. Jamal sat at his desk, the framed picture of Max propped beside his notebook. He glanced at it often, as though seeking reassurance. It had been a few weeks since the shelter fundraiser, and something had shifted inside him. The weight of Max's absence was still there, but it no longer crushed him. Instead, it had become part of him, a quiet ache that reminded him of everything Max had meant. Shadow, with his boundless energy and bright eyes, had given Jamal a way to move forward, step by step. A soft knock at the door broke his train of thought. "Yeah?" Jamal called. Charles stepped into the room, dressed in his usual sharp suit, but his expression was softer than Jamal had seen in weeks. "Hey, son, you busy?" Jamal shook his head. "Not really." Charles walked over and sat on the edge of Jamal's bed, his gaze falling briefly on Shadow, before shifting to the framed photo of Max. "You've been doing good lately," he said after a moment. "I know this hasn't been easy, but I want you to know how proud I am of you." Jamal felt his throat tighten at the words, but he nodded, looking down at his notebook to distract himself. "Thanks, Dad." Charles leaned forward slightly. "I got a call today from Captain Harris. The review panel finalized their report on Officer Collins." Jamal's stomach twisted. He sat up straighter, his voice cautious. "What did they say?" Charles exhaled slowly. "They found him guilty of misconduct, reckless escalation, and unnecessary force. He is being removed from duty permanently. No badge, no weapon. His career as a police officer is over." Jamal's shoulders sagged as the tension drained from his body. He hadn't realized how tightly he had been holding on to the outcome. "So? That's it?" Charles nodded. "That's it. They couldn't undo what happened to Max, but they made sure it would not happen again. People listened, Jamal. They heard your voice." Jamal looked out the window, his chest tight with emotions he could barely name. Relief, sadness, justice, in a form that felt bittersweet. "It still doesn't bring Max back," he whispered. "No," Charles agreed softly. "But you honored him. You stood up for the truth, and that matters." Jamal turned to look at his father. "Do you think Max would be proud?" Charles smiled faintly. "I know he would be." The next day, Jamal walked Shadow to the park for the first time. It was a sunny afternoon, and the park was alive with families, kids, and dogs running across the grass. Jamal felt a pang of memory, how he had once walked Max here, proudly watching as people admired him. Shadow tugged at the leash playfully, breaking through Jamal's thoughts. All right," Jamal muttered, smiling slightly as he let Shadow pull him toward the open field. The puppy ran in excited circles, his tail wagging as he barked at nothing in particular. Jamal watched him for a moment, a small smile pulling at the corner of his lips. It still hurt to think about Max, but watching Shadow explore the world with such joy made the pain feel easier to carry. "Jamal!" He turned at the sound of his name and saw Sarah walking toward him, waving with one hand and holding a cup of iced coffee in the other. She wore a bright smile that seemed to match the weather. "Hey," Jamal said, feeling a bit of the nervousness that always came with seeing her. Sarah crouched down immediately to pet Shadow, who bounced over to her eagerly. "He's getting big," she said, laughing as Shadow licked her hand. "You two seem good together." Jamal nodded, watching Shadow settle happily at Sarah's feet. "Yeah, he's helping." Sarah stood and looked at Jamal with quiet understanding. "I'm glad. You know, you've come a long way since everything happened." Jamal shrugged, glancing down at Shadow. "It still feels weird sometimes, like it all happened to someone else, but I think I'm okay. At least, better than I was." "You're stronger than you think, Jamal," Sarah said softly. "Most people would have crumbled, but you turned it into something good. Max would be proud." The words settled deep in Jamal's chest. He smiled faintly, nodding. "Thanks." Later that evening, Jamal and his father sat on the back porch, watching the sky turn from blue to streaks of gold and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. Shadow lay sprawled across Jamal's feet, his body warm and relaxed. "This used to be Max's favorite spot," Jamal said suddenly, breaking the silence. Charles looked over at him, his expression soft. "Yeah?" Jamal nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Every time I sat out here, he'd follow me and just lay there, like he was keeping watch. He always made everything feel okay." Charles's voice was gentle. He was a good dog. Jamal looked down at Shadow, who let out a soft sigh in his sleep. "Shadow is different. He's not Max, but I think he's what I need right now." Charles nodded. "Sometimes life gives us what we need, even if it looks a little different than what we wanted." They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the evening filling the quiet between them. Fireflies began to appear in the grass, their small lights blinking softly as the world settled into night. Jamal looked at his father, his voice thoughtful. "Do you think it's okay to be happy again? I mean, after everything that happened?" Charles smiled, his gaze steady. "It's not just okay, Jamal. It's what Max would want. Happiness doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying the love you had for him forward." Jamal looked up at the sky, the last light of the sun fading into darkness. The ache in his chest was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a reminder. Max was gone, but his memory lived on in the lessons he taught Jamal, in the love they had shared, and in the steps Jamal took to move forward. Shadows stirred at Jamal's feet, stretching before settling again. Jamal smiled faintly, reaching down to run a hand through the puppy's fur. "Good boy," Jamal whispered softly. For the first time since that terrible day, Jamal felt like he could see a path forward. It was not perfect, and it would never erase the loss, but it was his. It was built on kindness, on truth, and on the quiet strength he had discovered in himself. As the stars began to dot the sky, Jamal let out a slow breath, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. "We'll be okay, Max," he thought. "I promise." And somehow, deep in his heart, he knew that was true. The weeks turned into months, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. Shadow grew quickly, his energy endless, and his loyalty unshakable. He followed Jamal everywhere on long walks through the neighborhood, quiet afternoons at home, and trips to the park where Jamal could finally laugh again. Max's memory stayed with Jamal, not as an unbearable weight, but as a part of who he was. The love Max had given him taught Jamal that even in loss, there was still room to grow, to heal, and to hope. One sunny afternoon, Jamal sat on the back porch, watching Shadow chase butterflies in the grass. The warm breeze brushed against his face, and for the first time in a long while, the world felt calm. He thought about everything he had been through, how kindness from others, from Mr. Stevens, Sarah, and even strangers like Lisa, had helped him find his way back. His father stepped out onto the porch and sat down beside him, a cup of coffee in hand. "You've come a long way, son," Charles said quietly. Jamal nodded, smiling faintly as he watched Shadow tumble over himself in the yard. "Yeah," he said. "I think I finally get it." "Get what?" Charles asked, his brow raised. "That it's okay to move forward," Jamal said softly. "To carry the people or the dogs you love with you, but still make room for new things." Charles nodded with a proud smile. "Max would be happy to see you like this." Jamal looked up at the sky, the sunlight warm against his face. "Yeah," he whispered. "I think he would too." Shadow bounded back to the porch and sat at Jamal's feet, panting happily. Jamal reached down, scratching behind the puppy's ears. "Good boy, Shadow," he said, his voice filled with affection. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Jamal knew that while life had changed, he had found something important: hope, strength, and the power of kindness to carry him through. Thank you for watching this story. Jamal's journey reminds us that even in our darkest moments, kindness, love, and perseverance can help us move forward. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, heal, and bring us all a little closer together. Remember, hope is always just around the corner. See you in the next story. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new video.